Baxter Wynn is the minister of Pastoral Care at First Baptist Church in Greenville. His lifelong dedication to service has earned him the Urban League's Whitney M. Young Humanitarian Award, and for his role in the community-wide efforts to adopt the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday in Greenville County. Ladies and gentlemen, Baxter Wynn.
A little hard to follow somebody that's talking about testicles. Especially when you're a Baptist minister, that doesn't really go very well. I want to talk to you about my uncle, somebody that I put very high on a pedestal, maybe too high. The first time that I ever really got to know him was when we would go to Atlanta, where he lived, and go to family reunions. He was always the center of attention. Everybody sort of hung on his every word at the family reunions, and we lifted him up and respected him. He was kind of a hero to me. I had a great amount of admiration for him, in part because of what he overcame as a young person. He grew up in an extremely poor family. The family was always poor and got even worse in 1929 when his father lost his job, and my uncle had to drop out of school in the middle of the 10th grade and go to work. He got a series of odd jobs. He ended up working in a steel mill, but he worked extremely hard. Before very long, he was able to save enough money to buy a small piece of property pretty close to where Georgia Tech is in Atlanta and build a small restaurant. In fact, he built much of it with his own hands. And he began serving guys from the steel mill and people that worked and lived around that neighborhood, and also Georgia Tech students. Students love lots of food at very reasonable prices, and he provided that. So a lot of Georgia Tech students came to his restaurant. And all of a sudden, well, I shouldn't say all of a sudden, within time, he was very, very successful. He expanded the restaurant 6 or 7 times through the years. He ended up with 5 dining areas and 2 serving lines. He could seat 400 people in there, and he was serving 500,000 customers annually. So he was a tremendous success as a businessman. He was able to move his family out of this sort of poverty-stricken area in downtown Atlanta, moved them to the north side of town, to the suburbs, built a big, beautiful home there. I remember visiting when I was a child, and it was like a mansion. It was just a beautiful home out in the northern part of Atlanta. So he was incredibly successful. He also, at this time, became kind of a popular person in Atlanta. My uncle was a very flamboyant person, and so he became sort of a local celebrity. He began to speak out on political matters, and he spoke quite boldly. He was kind of a populist figure, and he could get people riled up about corruption at City Hall, or he'd talk about various state issues that he was concerned about. And then more and more he began talking about national issues. We're in now to the mid-50s, the late 50s, the early 60s, and my uncle began speaking his mind about civil rights. July the 2nd, 1964, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. The very next afternoon, July the 3rd, 64, 3 African-American seminary students from Atlanta decided to test that new federal law and see if they would be welcome at my uncle's restaurant. And so they drove in to the parking lot, and my uncle went to intercept them. I don't think I mentioned his name, did I? His name was Lester Maddox, and the name of the restaurant was the Pickrick restaurant. Uncle Lester went to intercept the students. His son, my cousin, Lester Jr., was carrying one of these, an axe handle. George Willis attempted to get out of on the driver's side, and Lester kicked the door shut. Reverend Albert Dunn, pictured here, put his coat on, got up, tried to walk towards the Pickrick, At that point, Lester drew the pistol that you see there. And he shouted, "Get back in the car. You're not going to eat here today. You're not ever going to eat here. The Pickrick will never be integrated." He got back in the car, and the car began to pull away. Someone from the crowd, there was a crowd behind them of customers also carrying pick handles, and someone from the crowd ran over and hit the top of the car, the roof of the car, and other customers poked pick handles through the open windows of the car as it drove away. I was an 11-year-old boy at the time, watching the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, which we did every night in my family, and this was the scene that I saw of my rich and famous uncle that I had on a pedestal. I didn't quite understand all that was taking place at my uncle's restaurant where I had eaten many, many times with my family. Before long, because of this confrontation, he became sort of a local celebrity and a folk hero, if you will, in Georgia and all across the South. He gave voice to the fears and to the opinions of many whites across the South that wanted to oppose the civil rights movement. And they wanted to fight in a fierce way, present every opposition they possibly could to the change in race relations that they were seeing taking place. Lester became one of their leaders. About a year later, he ran for governor of Georgia, and he was elected. And he was inaugurated in January of 1967. He actually gave my family this picture. My parents are sitting on the stage, and I'm out here freezing in January of 1967 as he's taking the oath of office. Proud day for the Maddox family, and a proud day for a young boy, me, sitting at the governor's chair. It's kind of cool having your uncle be the governor of a state, right? 16 months later, after he took the oath of office, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee, as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. You've seen the pictures, of course, of that scene. 5 days later, April 9th, 1968, Dr. King was to be buried in his hometown of Atlanta. City offices, businesses all over town were closed in respect to Dr. King. But Lester decided to keep the state capitol building open in a blatant show of disrespect. He also fought lowering the flag to half-mast during the funeral procession. He had received word that as the funeral procession came in front of the state capitol, that some of the mourners, people whom he referred to as communist and militant agitators, that some of the mourners might try to come on to the grounds of the Capitol and storm the Capitol, he said. And so he posted armed, helmeted patrolmen there, and he said, if any of the mourners come up on the grounds of the Capitol, lock the doors, lock the windows. And if any of the mourners proceed and come further towards the Capitol, he said, shoot them down and stack them up. Shoot them down and stack them up. Reminds me of that line, folks, you can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your family members. As a young boy, I was very proud of my rich and famous uncle. I did have him on a pedestal. As you can imagine, that as I grew and as I began to see the world differently myself, I became terribly embarrassed and mortified by being his nephew. Some of the roughest times for me was college years, especially when guys that I went to an all-guys school, and when guys would know me and know my connection with Lester, and here I was trying to meet new friends from all across the country, my roommate from Pittsburgh, and my old buddies that knew the connection with Lester would take great delight in telling these new friends of mine, do you know who his uncle is? And it would just make me fighting mad. It was infuriating to me. In later years, I have tried to learn more about him and to learn more about his family background. And The bottom line is I will never fully understand all of the influences that shaped and defined Lester. The strict fundamentalism of his childhood that he never questioned throughout his life, the grinding poverty that he knew as a child, the lack of education, dropping out of school in the 10th grade. I'll never understand all of those influences. But folks, the bottom line for me is that I will always love him. No matter what he did, no matter what he said or stood for, no matter what people think of him, frankly, no matter what you think of him, he was my uncle. He was my mother's brother. They were 2 years apart in age. But I have tried to look back over his life. I've tried to learn from him. I want to mention 3 things, particularly about his style of leadership. Just because tens of thousands of people are following you doesn't mean you're leading them in the right direction. Just because tens of thousands or maybe even millions of people put you up on a pedestal and declare that you are a great hero, that doesn't make you a hero. We need to choose our heroes very carefully. The second thought is this. We've heard a lot today about the importance of being passionate. Certainly that is true. But being passionate alone is not enough. No one was more passionate than my good old Uncle Lester. He was powerful and charismatic, and people listened when he spoke. Being passionate alone is not enough. Our ideas have power, not because we have an ability to express them in a very passionate way. Our ideas have power because they are right, and they are true, and they're good. A third thing is this, and I think about this a lot being a minister. Just because you are absolutely certain that you're on God's side and God is on your side doesn't make that true. Just because you believe you have received a divine revelation from God doesn't make that true. Lester believed that he was on sort of a divine crusade, a sacred crusade to protect and defend racial purity. And he believed that was what God intended. And he lifted verses out of the Bible to support his very strict views of segregation in precisely the same way that preachers all across the South lifted verses out of the Bible 100 years before to support the institution of slavery. He wasn't the last leader or politician, and he wasn't the first, and he certainly is not the last. It happens all the time for leaders and politicians to claim God's favor, God's blessing on them, while doing some very hideous and atrocious things. Thousands thought he was a hero. He spoke with tremendous passion and enthusiasm. He even believed he was speaking the Word of God and declaring God's intention, all the time fighting to maintain walls of separation between the races. And fortunately, other people at the same time were fighting to tear down those walls, break down those barriers of separation between human beings. It's no wonder that Dr. Martin Luther King once personally referred to my dear uncle as a sociological fossil. A lot to learn from him. I conclude with this. Looking back over the sweep of his life and his style of leadership, bigotry is an appalling lens through which to view the world. Bigotry is at the core of much of the cruelty and pain and meanness and destruction in our world today. And we see it every day. We hear it. We experience it. We are guilty of it ourselves. But I would say this. Bigotry, in all of its forms, not just racial bigotry, but bigotry in all of its forms, is an idea worth spreading. It is an idea once and for all worth spreading on the ash heap of history. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.